think so. I'm on now. Good afternoon, everyone. We've got the post-lunch shift, which means everyone's going to go to sleep, but they're not. Because I'm going to shout at everyone. They might just give it a moment to calibrate. I'm really sorry about the quality of my voice. I am post-COVID. I've just had COVID. This is week 5 and I just can't seem to get it back, and air conditioning makes it worse, so I do apologise. I won't be speaking much, it will be the panel, but I'm sorry about the quality. All right, we are here to discuss hitting the target, what's needed and who's needed, and I'm joined by an esteemed panel that I will now introduce to you. I'd just like to call out that we are being viewed live stream by many people online. I felt that we have maybe excluded you a little bit, so the panel and I are going to make sure that you also feel included. All right, to my immediate, you're on my right, Alec, aren't you, is Alec Webb. And Alec is the Executive Director at the Regional University Network, RUN, where he advocates for and champions the impact and importance of regional higher education. Next to Alec is his best friend in the world, he tells me, Dr. Matthew Brown, who is the Deputy Chief Executive of the Group of 8 universities. They have many things in common and also some differences. The panel members are chuckling. Matthew took up this role in May 2016 after having been Senior Director Policy at the Group of 8 since 2015. Paul Harris, I've switched the order again, I beg your pardon. No, Frank Coletta. Paul and Frank look a little bit alike, yeah, sorry. We are best friends. They did make a comment about being white men, so it was your comment, not mine. Frank Coletta is Executive Director at the Australian Technology Network of Universities, ATN, having previously been in the roles of Director of Public Affairs and Manager of Media Communication after joining ATN in 2022. Paul commenced as Executive Director of the Innovative Research Universities Network in September 2021, and prior to this worked for over 7 years in diplomatic positions in Australia's embassies, overseas. Every performance development conversation I've ever had has told me that I lack diplomacy, so I'm going to get some tips off you, Paul. And finally, and by no means least, Renee Hindmarsh joined Universities Australia as Deputy Chief Executive in 2023. Renee is an experienced advocate of higher education with an extensive background in leadership, policy and advocacy, including having most recently held the position of South Australian Skills Commissioner. Small job. So, welcome to the panel, and thank you very much for joining us today. I'm going to ask the questions, and I encourage the audience, both those playing along at home, at work, and those in the room, to put your questions into the Slido. I'm also going to get texted questions, and it's going to be chaos, so we'll see what happens. But we'll start off with some questions the panel may be expecting. So many of us in the room, myself included, remember the Bradley reforms, and we remember, I think it was December the 23rd, 2008, at about 5:30 p.m, roughly. I was still at work. It was a Friday. The Bradley report dropped, and many of us in the room. I'm not going to look over there very much, because if I do, my microphone doesn't work, and I have to do this. So I'm not excluding you. I just have to keep facing this way. Many of us remember staying back at work or taking it home on the eve of Christmas Eve and reading it, and the work that followed. And I've certainly worked with many people in this room, particularly, but not only, around students from low SES backgrounds. And I can see some heads nodding. Hello, Professor Nelson, Professor Kift, and others. My question to the panel is that the Bradley Review, as you will recall, had equity targets. What do you think will be different this time compared to the post-Bradley period? And I might just go in a row, it'll be predictable. Alec, you go first.
So I think there are a couple of things that are going to be different this time. One is we learnt some lessons from what happened in the Bradley Review. For my sins, I was a consultant back in the day, and that meant I worked on the HEP Review. And one of the challenges we had was identifying the difference between the HEP program and the demand-driven system. It was really hard to determine what was driving the choice. And so at RUN, we're obviously really, really pleased in the accord that not only is the needs-based funding aspect of that, which is so vital to regional universities, but we also, the management of places. So that managed growth is something that is going to be vitally important. And that was something that was lacking in the Bradley era. Combine this with the demand-driven system, where there was obviously a huge amount of pent-up demand to drive enrolments, and we saw that. At the moment, we are in a very different context. Domestic demand is either flat or down, and so when we think about how we set those targets for the Accord and how we improve student equity, we're in a very different environment. So having those targets, being up to date with data, hopefully, something the ATEC talks about a lot, is using that data to help drive policy. I believe that that is the key difference than what happened in the Bradley.
Great. Thank you, Alec. Matt?
Yeah, I think reflecting on a lot of what's been said today and what Alec was saying, it's a lot to do with targets and data. And what we saw through the Bradley review and the demand-driven system is that really the primary focus was on the 40% attainment target. And it was, I think, perhaps helped that the low SES target, which appeared later in the report, so perhaps a secondary target, that would just happen as an artefact of opening the doors generally to the demand-driven system. That didn't happen. We certainly got to the 40% attainment, so we got that target. But the fact that we weren't specifically targeting with actions that low SES group meant that we didn't get anywhere near it. I think we're at 17.1%, I think the briefing material for this session said. So it's not enough just to open the doors. You need to have specific mechanisms in place. And so as we move into this next phase where we're trying to encourage an increase in equity enrolments and success, I should say, we need to be more specific targeting in what we do. And there's also a question around the data as well. You know, with the Bradley review and the 40% attainment target, we got that. But if you drill down, you know, this is where the data analytics really comes in. That 40%, exceeding 40% covers a multitude of sins. You know, the distribution of the results across geography, it's profoundly different. State-based, regional, there's huge variations for equity groups, and also often not mentioned, a huge gender disparity in terms of the attainment as well. So we need to be more sophisticated in how we are looking at the data, and I think perhaps we'll come back to that later, but that's a huge issue around equity concerns in terms of defining equity groups and how we report on them. It's been mentioned a lot today, but this data element is critical.
Thanks, Matt. Frank, what's your thought?
Marcia, just on that point, picking up on it, there's evidence, everyone would suggest that perhaps we haven't met targets from Bradley, but there's certainly evidence, and I'm speaking from an ATN University's perspective, as I'm here to do, and most certainly some of our universities and us as a collective have met those targets and beyond. So I just wanted to cover that off. But the other point being, how are we different? Well, we are being made to be accountable now. Now, the advisory committee, we heard about them earlier on, are going to inform ATEC, and ATEC will be there to make sure that those targets in some ways are met. So I guess, yes, there are naysayers suggesting that perhaps we haven't got to where we were supposed to. In some cases we have. But we're at a point now where we will be accountable moving forward. And these reforms are not for today. They're for, as Jason was saying earlier on, they're for the current day. They're going to outlive him in the portfolio and the cycle of government. And so I think, as I say, putting something in like the ATEC will play a pivotal role.
Great, thank you. Paul?
I feel like my colleagues have done a good job of talking about the key sort of policy and funding features of the Bradley review and where we are now. I guess one thing I just wanted to add, I thought it was really striking this morning that the Minister talked very starkly about a segregated schools education system. And I think that is something that we have to pay attention to. I think the widening gap between private schools and public schools in this country is a real issue that is going to have a bearing on how we move forward with the targets and the goals in the Accord. We sort of went through, as I'm sure all of you did, the budget papers from the federal budget, and buried in the budget papers are forward estimate projections of this is just federal government, not state government. Federal government funding for private schools continues to rise over the forward estimates to about $18 billion a year. Public school funding about $12 billion a year. funding for public higher education, $11 or $12 billion a year, public funding for vet, about $3 billion a year. And so those gaps are getting wider, and that is different, I think.
Yeah, great, thank you very much. Renee.
So going last, a lot of my colleagues have really covered off a number of the main points, but from our perspective, in terms of what's different this time, I would agree with Alec in terms of it's been a really good opportunity for us as a sector to reflect on what's worked and what hasn't worked. And for us at Universities Australia, we're really focused on the long-term nature and the aspiration of some of the goals that are outlined in the Accord. And I think the panel should be commended for their ambition in the Accord and the government in its response through the budget process initially. To get to where we want to get to, and I think everyone in this room wants to get there, and again I have the same microphone issue, so sorry, over here, but to get to where we want to get to, it's going to require really long and sustained and evidence-backed advocacy to really bring people along the journey with us and to create that narrative that inspires people to make sure that the funding does flow through and that we do see an outcome all the way to 2050. I think that's really important. And picking up on some of the themes mentioned by my fellow panellists, I think it's also important to think about the importance of lifelong learning and the role that getting people back into a tertiary qualification, either who've never completed one or completed one in the last millennia, like I did, then that can come with its own challenges. And Australia's literacy statistics are actually sobering. And if you look at illiteracy rates, at the moment, 1 in 5 Australians is not where we want them to be. So there's a lot of work that we need to do to make sure that we can achieve those targets. So I think
great, thank you, Renee, thank you, panel. So just to summarise, if I can, because by the end I won't remember with my post-COVID brain what was said, some of the differences between the Bradley era and this era we've now entered, the Accord era, or the O'Kane era, whatever we're going to call it. Managed versus demand-driven growth, very good point Alec made, and the importance of data. Data came up a few times in your comments. Matt, your comment about specific mechanisms in place, I wonder whether some of the equity practitioners in the room might have comment on that, because I think we did have some mechanisms in place. Perhaps they weren't as effective as we wanted, or perhaps there are different ones required, but there's differences, but there's also similarities. The accountability piece, a few of you mentioned, and the role of ATEC. I don't think we should wait for ATEC, and that's probably going to come to my next question about accountability. More attention, Paul, to the widening gap between public and private, very important, and that evidence-informed and sustained advocacy you mentioned, Renee. That also is a form of data. The stories, which the Minister and Harleen have used this morning, is a very powerful form of data. Quite often when we talk of data, we think of the quantitative and the numbers and the percentages, but both are important. So I will pick up on that point and the point Frank made in particular around individual and collective accountability and responsibility. So that's my question to the panel, and I might mix it up. Is that all right? In order, because when you go last, it's really hard, right? So what is our individual and collective accountability in relation to the equity targets this time? Let's start with Frank, because you brought that up. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've been set a challenge, Marcia, and ultimately, I think the measures are important, and I'd like to have a discussion around: is it a sector as a whole as a success? And we heard harmonisation mentioned earlier on, or do we pay due credit where it is due on an individual level? I did make a brief mention of some of the ATN universities hitting their targets and beyond. So I think there's a discussion that needs to be had around how we measure that success and that accountability. So I'd like to have a discussion about that, and happy to take some from the floor. But if I can take it a step further, actually, I want to touch on what Paul mentioned earlier on and look at where it all starts. I think we need to now look at education as, again, that harmonisation as a global. It has to start much earlier. We have to go to a point where we have to speak of the value of education in as an entity. And I think that's where we're missing a little bit. Earlier on, we heard a lot about participation, aspiration, opportunity. But what does that mean on the ground level? What does that mean for not just the individual, but the family, the different cultures, that sort of thing? So I think there's a broader discussion that needs to be had. And I think we need to get in there earlier, because you're talking about, I grew up not far from here. I'm a proud Mounties lad. I was from the Golden Southwest of Mount Pritchard. And when the discussion around education happened in my household, migrant family, very much working class stock, it was about education being a temporary roadblock to what was the real issue, and that was about getting to work and adding to the family, and it basically meant getting a job. So we need to talk about the value of education at the very start. And again, I go back to that terminology that was used earlier on, harmonisation. That's got to be the starting point. What's the value of what we are offering? That language needs to change. And I went a little bit off topic there, but that to me is the essence. If we get to the very start of the matter, that's the important.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Matt, your response to Frank's provocation, quoting his ATN stats as he has and making comment through doing that about perhaps other sectors.
I'm happy to put the numbers on the table.
And he's happy to put the numbers on the table, which means he's got a strong case. So the how-to and how to measure, and whether it is sector as a whole or due credit where credit's due. Do you have a response to that?
Look, on the accountability, I think obviously that's critical, but it's an accountability in a number of different guises, I guess, including what Frank has mentioned. One is accountability for here and now starting to improve equity outcomes. So, and I think this is not something we have to wait for the ATEC to deliver. All universities understand their social contract. It's different depending on the university, its location, its particular circumstances. But we all understand our social contract and the responsibility to deliver equity outcomes. I'll go with the group of 8, that's who I'm talking about. All of our Vice-Chancellors are very strongly committed to leveraging the success that we have in terms of completions and successful outcomes from equity cohorts. But our missing part is probably to increase the participation. So all of our unis are moving in that space. University of Melbourne has its NARM scholarships. UQ has the Queensland commitment. The new university in Adelaide, I think it's got a $120 million commitment for an equity fund, so that in some sense they're self-accountable, which is not to say that there doesn't need to be a system of measuring and accountability. So that's on one scale, but sort of connecting into what Frank was saying, we also have to be accountable to the nation in terms of the big picture. So what's driving the accord is the 80% tertiary attainment target by 2050, and that's pretty close to what we recommended actually in our submission. So we have to think about our accountability in having that harmonisation of the system, of getting to that 80%, and it's not just about our 55%, as we heard from Barney earlier. There's the extra, can I do the maths, the 25% that's outside the university sector, and we have a responsibility, I think, in that context to be saying that, well, that's not a second choice. Not everybody necessarily needs to go to university, and we have a responsibility to foster a system in which these are all good choices, and what we provide as universities is one of those good choices.
Thank you, Matt. Renee, so you're not last.
Thank you. So I think, when we think of ourselves as a sector, there is a role for us to storytell when it comes to the role that we play in generating the knowledge-based economy that Sharmat was talking about in his opening remarks, and that equity is such a critical role as part of that. But it's also interesting to me, picking up on some of the other themes from today, also the role that some of the policies that government is imposing on the sector in terms of the support for student policy, or ways of really elevating that accountability, not just at an institutional level through compacts, but also saying this is a priority for us as a government, and that the sector is demonstrating the great work that happens in institutions, how we can really not only help to facilitate the aspiration for students who may want to participate in higher education, but to really foster their success throughout their journey in higher education and ultimately get to a completion and, as Frank said, for many people, an outcome in terms of getting a job.
Thank you. I do think it's important, just picking up on Penny Jane's comments this morning about what success means, and we've mentioned completion a few times. That isn't always what defines success. We have to be very careful, I think, about ensuring that success is determined by the student, who may or may not wish to complete or may wish to pick and choose, etc. But thank you, Renee. Who hasn't spoken? I've lost track. Paul, thank you.
So
Sorry, Alec.
if we're talking about equity targets and we're talking about accountability, I think our view would be that all universities have a role to play, and it's going to be different for different universities. But to go back to Renee's point and Charmot's point earlier, we're talking about systematic uplift across the country. And I think one of the great sort of success stories of policy making in Australia is the expansion of the higher education system over decades. You know, the universities in our group, the IRU, are universities that were founded in the late 60s, early 70s, and then again through the Dawkins reforms, to take the benefits of higher education and research to more communities across the country. That's why our universities were founded. And that's been really successful. And it is about opportunity and uplift for communities across the country. I don't think we want to be in a situation where we're saying some communities get some of the benefits and others don't. Some communities have to care about equity and others don't. It has to be everyone has a role to play, everyone's accountable. But I think we know that a sort of simplistic target or a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to deliver the outcomes that we're looking for. And so I think that's where we really do want to try and pick up on the promise in the Accord final report. Think about how different universities would have different targets and be accountable for those, and then what is the role of the Commission in working with individual institutions and keeping an eye on how the system as a whole is operating, because we know that the decisions of one university or TAFE will have an impact on other institutions in the system.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask you the question anyway. But first, Alex, to the individual and collective and/or collective accountability, responsibility, what would your response be from the RUN perspective?
I would definitely echo Paul's comments. This has to be all institutions have to play a role in this. Now, RUN, we do the lion's share of equity education in Australia. We enrol approximately 12% of all domestic undergraduate students, but 28% of all regional students study at our universities. 24% of all First Nations undergraduate students study at RUN universities, and 22% of all low SES students study at ours. At the moment, that's not equally shared across the sector. Many of my members have met the population parity and exceeded it. For Australia as a whole, when we think about the Accord, all the institutions need to do their part. And, you know, some sympathy towards Matt and the Group of 8, because they do get a bit of a bad rap here. But historically, some institutions have prided themselves on only catering to the elite few. And that cannot maintain it. That policy and that mindset needs to fundamentally shift. If we don't shift that, we'll never hit those targets. But it's more than just encouraging the students and getting them on campus and hitting that, you know, that target. It's all about what happens when they're on campus and that experience. And that's where regional universities, so ingrained in their communities, work hand in hand to ensure that those students succeed. We talk about pathways into university, and that's where we see things like demand-driven enabling as being vitally important, and free preparation courses as being critical as that first step. But it goes beyond that, and it's a cultural shift as much as anything for staff at universities to actually understand what the supports are to enable those students to succeed. It's not going to be just come up to a lecture full of, 1,500 Business 101 students and, hey, if some of them drop out, well, that's okay. That mindset just has to fundamentally shift to help meet those targets.
Thank you. I noticed Dan Edwards in the room earlier, so Dan and I and some other colleagues did some research around a matter that's sort of been raised in your comments, and the idea of cost compensation, because regional and other universities often do the heavy lifting in terms of aspiration raising, outreach right back to primary school. Someone mentioned that this morning. But then those students don't enrol in the university that's done the work to raise the aspirations and prepare them for university. And so it's a very complex thing to do, but it's not impossible. And we work with some very clever economists who, Dan and I didn't understand what they were talking about. Well, yeah, he's smiling. But they had very sensible principles for how this could actually work and could happen, so that people are compensated. Universities are compensated for the work they've done as part of the collective system to raise aspirations and prepare people who might go to a different institution. Now, Alec, I'm going to ask you this question that you don't want me to ask, but I have to honour the audience. And please, people playing at home, put your questions in, and Ian will moderate and send them through. The question for Alec is to your earlier first comments. Did HEP improve equity outcomes? He says it's impossible to answer, but I'm going to give him a shot anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you've answered my question. No, it was really, really difficult. So we would say that it didn't harm, right? That additional funding and the things that HEP were funded obviously made a huge difference in terms of raising aspiration, especially around the aspiration piece. When it came time to analyse the projects, the data collection just wasn't there. And it made it virtually impossible to determine things like, okay, you've got this HEP-funded program at an institution. How many students engaged with that? And the universities quite often were unable to tell us as consultants. And, as someone who lived his life as an economic public policy expert, and I see, Andrew Norton here in the room as well, the key thing of all these programs is data collection has to be built into design. And the hope is with the ATEC and this focus on equity is a really considered and carefully planned approach to how universities engage with these student cohorts. How do they expend that needs-based funding to ensure that they're actually driving real outcomes? Because if we as a sector don't stop and sit back and reflect upon whether or not our scheme worked and what the metrics are, then it's going to be impossible for us to meet these targets and actually learn from what is working, and conversely, and perhaps more importantly, what's not working. Because at the end of the day, this is taxpayers' money, and we all want the best for the students.
What about the argument about universal design? So certainly when I was the Senior Deputy Vice-Chancellor in terms of HEP funding, and Karen Nelson will back me up here, I hope, we would use the funding to make sure that the quality of teaching and learning, as one example, was uplifted across the board. Not single out low SES students, which is where the space Karen and I worked in together, put them in a special room and brand them and then do something different, but that the quality of teaching and learning, the explicit instruction where it was required, the making the implicit assumptions of what a student needed to do to succeed, explicit, etc., happened for all students. So I know we made your data collection really annoying, but we also know that we uplifted quality of teaching and learning across all cohorts. What would you say?
I think that's really important. I think we need to consider how we articulate this to government, because the Accords set out the targets. At some point, at least I hope, the government is going to ask the questions of how are we tracking to do those. And with that additional needs-based funding, how are you using that within your institutions? And I think that's where we, as a group of advocates, we often talk about how important it is, but we also understand the challenges at an institutional level of how that is captured and reported. And you talked about storytelling, that's one part of it, but the universal, uplift, we have to see that in the data. And if we don't, then I think the government can rightly start asking questions from economists like me.
Yes, indeed. Paul?
Can I just throw in one other kind of perspective on the evidence? I'm not an economist either, but the government has some pretty good economists in the Productivity Commission, and they've been very clear that the return on public investment in education and higher education is significant. It's improved social cohesion, it's reduced inequality, it's improved health and well-being, it's improved uptake of innovation in the community, it's reduced demand on government support payments. And the Productivity Commission in 2022 said, we have not yet reached the point where we've sort of maxed out the return on public investment in education. And they particularly honed in on this issue of equity in higher education and said if you were going to invest more, that's where you'd target your investment.
Which, if you don't mind, Renee, I'll move on. It sort of segues beautifully with this next question I've received. So education is a human right throughout life. Can we go back a step and ask what each panel member actually understands by the concept of equity. Easy question. Especially in and for higher education. I've started with you, Alec. I might start with you, Matt. Sorry, that's a difficult question, but what do you understand, what does the GO8 understand by the concept of equity?
Yep, it is a tough question, but I guess to distill it to its essence, so we think of equity as, our approach to equity is to support a system that provides equal learning opportunities regardless of background. But in addition to that, that it supports students within that educational framework for success. Now, I know we're being a little bit, we're not trying not to use the word completion, but success as broadly interpreted. So there's those two parts. It's the sort of the access regardless of your background, and once you've sort of got that access, the support to success through your educational process.
Good old Vincent Tinto, opportunity without support is not success, is that right? Who knows? Is that the right quote? There's some nods. I think I got it nearly right. Thank you. Let's go along. Oh, you want to speak? Actually, I interrupted Renee before. Sorry. Conscious of the gender imbalance of this panel, I'm going to go to Renee first.
So I think removing barriers to participation and aspiration are really important. And if that's me, it's going to be. Oh, it's my lanyard.
Yes.
Right. Sorted. Sorry to everyone in the room. So I think removing barriers to participation and aspiration is really important, and you can't do that without support. And I think when we talk about support, it's not just on universities to support students. Obviously that is important, but students don't operate in a vacuum. They're human beings, and so support is also the broader ability to participate in education through things like AusStudy, AbStudy, Youth Allowance, things that make it really challenging, and that there is an acknowledgement that financial support is critical. We're seeing that through the prac payments at the moment, but we do have to recognise that our students are people and humans, and there's complexity with that.
Thank you, Renee. Alec?
I would say, I would agree with everything that Renee and Matt have said on the student side. But I think there's another point there around equity in higher education, and that's about equity between institutions. At the moment, you've probably all seen the news about financial accounts being tabled with Parliament. There is huge discrepancy between institutions across this country. And when we think about what we need to achieve equity for students, you need equity among institutions so that those students can get the opportunity and the same experiences across each one of the 39 universities in this country. And at the moment, there is distinct difference, and we need to address that. Now, things like needs-based funding will obviously go some way to that. Things like regional loading will obviously be very, very welcomed by regional universities. However, we're still a long way away when we consider just the concentration and inequities that exist in international student income, when we consider research income. They're so highly concentrated to 4 or 5 elite universities that how is that fair for the majority of Australians?
So that's a very interesting point. It's related to this next question. Given their critical importance, who will decide and set the criteria for what equity targets are? And that individual collective again, and some of us remember the old compact days, and on what basis? What are your thoughts about how that should be decided? And don't say ATEC. Because ATEC should be informed by the sector and by people who have views on that. So let's say ATEC are going to do that, we know that. Matt?
Sorry, I respect the question, but I really have to jump in, given what Alec has just said. He's sort of basically impugned the group of 8 to some extent. And it's really, I guess when we're having this discussion about equity, the one thing that we don't want to do is retreat to our corners and sort of fight from that perspective. You know, that makes it a zero-sum game, that if we're just looking how we're carving up the existing pie, we really need to be looking at how we're expanding the system, and we can only do that by working together. So we need to look at some of the recommendations from the Accord about improving funding, and we need to recognise the role of the institutions, higher education institutions more broadly. And by that I mean some of the universities in the group of 8 undertake huge research portfolios on behalf of the country. And that's where a lot of the funding that they win on the basis of excellence, so it's not elitism, it's excellence, that's represented by the group of 8 universities. And that's something that I guess our ethos is that goes with equity as well. Equity and excellence go together, and that's the sort of the group of 8 approach. But it's this excellence that's seen in research where a lot of that funding goes to. In national terms, the group of 8 are responsible for 20% of the entire nation's expenditure on research. So when we're talking about equity in these institutions, we have to look at the entire performance of the institution. Equity in research is an important part. Equity cohorts who come into group of 8s get experience to that research intensive environment as well, and it's that excellence that goes with the equity. So I think it's treating it as a zero-sum game where we would just redistribute income that's earned on the basis of excellence is probably not going to get us where we need to be. We need to maintain that excellence, we need to maintain our international reputation as a sector, and we need to focus on not treating it as a zero-sum game, but how we can have a rising tide that floats all boats, as they say.
All right, I'm going to get between you two if you start punch-ups. Paul.
Can I just build on what Matt was saying about equity in research? I mean, I think it would be really good for us to take our focus on equity right across everything that universities do. We should be thinking about research and, making the connection from the review of the ARC back into the Accord. The ARC had really important recommendations about investing more in Indigenous-led research because of the impact that would have for Indigenous researchers, but for the work of universities and for communities much more broadly. Those weren't expensive recommendations, but they would make a real difference, and we should be bringing that into the discussion. I think in the way we talk about international education, we should be thinking about equity as well. We're so focused at the moment about how many international students are coming into this country and the migration strategy of the government. But we should be having a much broader conversation about the value of international education for our community and for communities all around the region. And it shouldn't just be about how many students come here to pay international student fees in Australia, but how are we investing in partnerships in the Pacific, in the region. And so I think it can actually be a really useful way to think about the work that universities do much more broadly.
Thank you. Very interesting point. I mean, the thing about international students is whatever else we might say, they bring money and funding keeps coming up, and how will things be paid for and distributed, etc. Sorry about my voice.
I think,
Marcia,
Marcia, if I can,
yes.
I think we got a taste of where I'm going just then with the discourse that took place. Our language as a sector, and I'm talking about tertiary generally, is important moving forward, because I think what we've seen from the very top with the Education Minister, with the government, they are willing to listen to what we have to say. So clearly with the advisory committee, clearly with ATEC in the offing very soon, things will adapt and will change a long time as long as we stay in the tent, as it were. So I think that's important that we do, and to Matt's point, it's not a bash-up G08 issue, it's about us all working harmoniously as much as possible. We are competitive forces, of course, but there's value in doing that, because the government does have the ear to the ground. They're listening to us, and they're being informed by us all along the way. I don't think one failing that we could have is that we assume what the government is doing, and I guess we got a taste of it today with the PRAC payment, and Jason actually sat here and said, well, it's not set in stone. We're looking at options, so the means testing side of things. And that, to me, that's gratifying. That's to say, no, we're not going to put these in place without actually consulting. So I think our language is important moving forward.
And harmonisation within the sector as well as between higher ed and vocational ed and schools. So harmonisation within, and priorities within the priorities. I'm summarising what Paul said, less eloquently than Paul said it. Renee, did you want to make a comment?
Oh, look, I think my colleagues have probably covered it off enough.
I've got a really difficult question here that I've avoided because I don't understand it. So good luck, panel. How will targets incorporate intersectional and data collection issues within measurement of equity access? Oh, there's nodding. Good. Like the disability concerns in the Accord. So you nodded, Paul, and you nodded, Matt. So first and second.
mean, I think we've heard a lot. I mean, and I would actually like to give credit to Access, formerly Neshi, for really good work over the years on improving the data that we have on to inform work on student equity. Going all the way back to the Bradley Review, the Bradley Review said we need a fundamental improvement in how we gather and use data about student equity. Many of the Bradley recommendations have not yet been fully implemented, so we know that we've got to have much better student data, university data, research data, you name it. And I think the point about intersectionality is a really important one. We've got to be able to think about these things in a more sophisticated way so that we can target our public investment. You know, the thing I take away about the discussion of needs-based funding is a genuine commitment from government to be prioritising public money to where it is most needed. And that's really critical, but we've got to be able to evidence that and target it to where it's going to have the biggest impact.
Thank you. Matt?
Yeah, this is a really critical issue, and it's something that the Group of 8 Equity Working Group, led by Mark Weston, spends a lot of time looking at this idea of the data, the definitions, and the intersectionality, or the compounding disadvantage, if you like. What we've seen in the publicly released data is that they give you a spreadsheet or a report of data where you get a list of the different equity groups and the number in each. And I know that Access does a deeper analysis, but basically what's publicly available, it's almost like these are separate groups. You know, you've got your low SES, you've got your regional, you've got your First Nations, disability, and others. And the way they report it looks like that's just that they're individual. And in fact, what you don't see in the reporting is where you have multiple factors of disadvantage occurring at the same time. And of course, that's where the need is greatest. So if we have any chance of trying to target initiatives, we have to have better data that allows us to drill down into that. And alongside that is also, if you're not defining the data points properly or in an appropriate way, you're also not getting that information. So there are, as we know, huge issues around definitions of, say, low SES that are pretty clumsy at the moment. And what certainly Group of 8 institutions find is that they don't find those definitions so useful, and they are sort of internally working on their own sort of equity reporting, which allows them to interrogate in a much more useful and specific way the individual circumstances of each student. And I think that that probably goes into another point that was raised earlier about how institutions are equipped to handle equity students, whether there's a difference between institutions. That's something we found out during the Support for Students policy discussion, is that we did a sort of deep dive on what all our institutions do, and they do a lot of tracking of the performance of students, including on an equity basis. Some institutions sort of have AI algorithms, predictive algorithms, which can, you know, attempt to predict when a student might fall into difficulties with their studies. So I guess it's a roundabout way of saying that the data and analytics, the definitions, the looking at the multiple disadvantage, this sophisticated approach, if we don't have that, then we won't achieve what we need to.
Yeah, thank you. Did you want to say something, Alex?
Yeah.
Alec, sorry.
I'll pick up on Matt's point there. Compounding disadvantage is really, really important. But this ties into the issues around data. So at RUN, we know that if you're a student at RUN, you're 2.5 times more likely to be both a regional and an Indigenous student, and twice as likely to be Indigenous and low SES. Now, we did that work as part of the Accord, but it took us about 3 months of data requesting through the Department of Education to get the data required to do the calculation. And whether it's an ATEC, whether it's the Department of Education, the current data lag and the lack of information in terms of timely data is just unacceptable going forward. That needs to be changed. We're talking about 2022 student data, 2021 for applications data. How can we determine what is happening in our sector at a sectoral level if we don't have access to timely data?
Yes, I work in government now. I can answer that, but not in a public forum. Okay, we're going to move to questions in the room. I assume some of the questions that have come through to me have come from online. Thank you. So we are including our colleagues across the nation who are on the live stream. So questions from the floor. And if you could just state your name, we all know who you are, but tell us anyway, John.
Thank you. John Ross from Times Higher Education. So just on this talk, all this discussion about the importance of data, one of the things I noticed on budget night, but forgot to report because there's so much going on, was a cut of funding to the QUILT program, which provides very important data, and continuity of that data is important. It seems ironic that the same budget that kicks off a whole lot of these really brave Accord equity reforms is also making a bit of a cut to one of the vital sources of data. I'm just seeking any commentary from the panellists on that.
Form an orderly queue, panel. Whoever makes eye contact. Paul, congratulations.
Sure. I think the Accord report and the first stage of the government's response to the Accord final report make it very clear that this reform is not going to succeed without better data.
Very succinct, thank you. Others? Is there anything else to say? Got something for your article, John? Other questions?
Probably doesn't answer your question, John, but to what my colleagues have said, data, numbers, that's the storytelling we're all talking about. So yes, I'm not directly answering your question, but the importance of it cannot be diminished, absolutely.
And I think it's fair to say that we've repeated it throughout the session, that data helps make better policy. So regardless of the mechanism of how that's achieved, to have good data means better policy.
Other questions in the room? Otherwise I can go to another Slido one. Don't see any hands. Let's pivot a little bit. Oh, one here.
Thank you.
Just reintroduce yourself.
Oh yeah, no worries. So my name's Evie. I'm a master's student at Deakin University and also the Deputy Chair of Children and Young People with Disabilities Australia. Absolutely picking up on what John just mentioned around QUILT. We're talking about headcount, we're talking about bums on seats. I was scrolling through the questions online and I think whoever submitted that summarised it really well. They talked about this characterisation of students as cash cows and like unlocking funding for universities based on the number of disadvantaged students that you can bring into your institution. How can we reshift this conversation back to actually students attending your institutions and having a really bloody good time when they're there and ending up with exactly what they need out of their education to improve their life going forward?
Great question, thank you. Renee.
I think it is a great question, and I think in our experience, institutions are doing that already. We've worked with all of our member universities to get some amazing case studies of where things are working really well, and the driver of people who go into higher education is often to make the world better and to make it a great experience for students who attend the institutions. That's what gets people out of bed in the morning rather than a spreadsheet for most people. And there's no judgment. But I think sometimes there can be a disconnect in our own storytelling because you're responding to a call for submissions or you're responding to data. But when institutions are going about their business, or you look at the strategic plans or things like that, often the driver is to achieve the very outcome that you speak of.
Cool.
A quick shout out for the importance of student experience survey data, because it is important for informing how universities make decisions. I think the way we would flip this around and thinking about how is this new funding model that the government is proposing actually going to work in practice? How are we going to have a system where it's not one size fits all, but there is accountability for public money? I think we would like to see much more of a focus on the mission of the university. And I think we need to really unpack a little bit what we mean when we say mission-based compacts, and a credit to my colleague Andrew Harvey over there from Griffith University, who's thought a lot about, is it place-based compacts, is it mission-based compacts, is it equity-based compacts? What exactly are we talking about here? But starting a conversation with government that is about, this is what we think the mission of our public university is, this is the place where we're located, this is the community or communities we think we're serving, and this is what we think it's going to take to do that really well. And starting your conversation with government about money like that, rather than about spreadsheets and formula, I think would be really positive.
And Marcia, asking the question and providing the solution is kind of what we're talking about. So I think that's key. Not going there with the problem. Let's actually feed the problem and say this is how we fix it.
Great. I've got a question that asks you to rise above is the wrong word, step out of your advocacy, take your advocacy hat off, I guess. What role, if any, does the panel see for non-university providers, including TAFEs, RTOs, university colleges, institutes? What's their role in contributing to the targets?
Can I kick
Yes,
this
of
one?
course.
Well, obviously, as a former skills commissioner, non-university providers, particularly in the vocational education, are something that I know very well. And we'll never achieve our targets without that. But, you know, to your point, it's not just about targets. You think about Australia as an economy and a place to live, and it depends on where you are as to what your aspiration is or what the opportunities are. And sometimes that's a university solution, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes what you want to do and the opportunities that are available to you to stay in your community are better suited to vocational education. And we should be able to celebrate that. And as Matt says, that all boats rise on a tide. This is really important, and I think it's a critical part of the accord and understanding our entire ecosystem and the opportunity it brings to people and the aspiration that it will deliver is extraordinary.
Thank you. Anyone else, Matt?
Yeah, I think sort of addressing this question, it's worth, as was suggested, stepping back, but stepping back to take the long view. If we're looking at the 80% target, that's a 2050 target. So a lot of the discussion we've been having is very much in the here and now. What's going to happen next? What's the ATEC going to look like? What do we do about job-ready graduates funding? And that's very much here and now, and that's important. But if we're looking into that big picture, you know, we need to think about, well, what does the seamless tertiary sector, as we like to put it, look like? Not just universities, not just TAFEs, but the whole gamut of institutions we're going to need. And, you know, Mary O'Kane raised an example this morning of perhaps an equity-based institution. You know, so we need to consider all of these things, and there'll be lots of room for different university providers and non-university providers. But just to go back to the here and now, I think it is important to consider non-university providers, TAFE, vocational education and training providers as well right now.
There's a lot of them, that's right.
Yep.
And yeah, the 2050 is a bit scary. I worked out how old I'm going to be while you were speaking. So, Alec, I think you wanted to say something then, Paul.
I think the public discourse on this is really important, and it's not just a linear relationship between, you know, school, you might then go to vet, then you go to university. Actually, what's going to happen in the future is there's going to be a greater movement between the sectors, and everyone has a role to play. Now, as much as I can remove myself from the regional lens, the independent sector and the vocational sector is vitally important in providing educational services to Australians, no matter where they are. And there are a lot more independents than the 39 universities at UA. And so it's about setting up the environment that encourages that mobility between the educational sector, because industry's changing quite rapidly in some areas, and that's going to require constant upskilling and reskilling. And so that means you might do your bachelor's degree, then you'll dip into vet to do a course, then you might come back to university. And removing this, I guess it's been a bit of a stigmatised issue in the past of, you know, you went to vet, or, you know, well, I'm going to hire that person because they went to uni. We need to break down those barriers, and I think the independent sector has a huge role to play there.
Thank you. There's a question on the left of the room somewhere. If you could just introduce yourself.
Thank you. Out of line of sight. Professor Abby Cathcart from QUT. I endorse the discussion and reflection on data, and for sure in terms of parts of our sector that are looking with great attention, that would include the EdTech sector, who are looking for seeing the opportunities that our focus on data is going to drive. I do wonder if the panel might reflect, though, on language as well as data. The discussion around compounding disadvantage and equity groups tends to detract from the focus on humans that make up those equity groups, and may actually have very different opinions around whether their identity should be seen as a disadvantage to be compounded or otherwise. So I just welcome any reflections on the choice of language that people are using in the discussions today.
Just before we go to the panel, I have the power. Ian, don't worry. I'm going to go to Peter Anderson. Is that okay for a response? Could you bring the microphone down here, please? Peter and I had a mini discussion about some of this earlier, so sorry to put you on the spot, but
thanks,
no,
Abby. I think it's really interesting, and particularly, given that where we are in Australia and the referendum and how we've come, I don't see myself as Indigenous as an equity group. And the conversations of putting me into a group actually further stigmatises me. I am of the first people of this country. Education has done horrific things to my people, and it continues to do so. I am not an equity group, and we should be treated as sovereign people who we are. Through programs like this, we are, I just keep saying, it is our fundamental human right for education. So I leave you with that thought, that Indigenous is not an equity group. And for many of our students, they come to us and say, I'm not an equity group, I'm actually quite fine. Yet you say that I'm not self-determined, and I need to, this whole rhetoric around self-determination and lifting yourself up. We're right. It's actually the system. So when you fix that, can you come back?
thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. Yes. I knew he was going to say something like that, and I think we needed to hear it.
Marcia,
Other reflections?
Can I just pick
Frank,
up on that point?
Of course.
And we talk a lot about aspiration and opportunity and the like. If you stigmatise someone, and it goes for First Nations as much as it does from someone from a lower SES cohort, let's call it, then that aspiration is diminished, because you're basically funneling me into a position where I feel like I'm lesser. So our language is absolutely imperative. I think there's a lesson for us in terms of the internal versus the external. We know what we're dealing with internally as a sector, but that messaging outside of our walls is important. And we need to make people who we'd like to participate feel valued. And I agree, I don't think we do with the language that we use, and we need to alternate. We need to change that.
Thank you, Frank. Matt?
Yeah, I think the point is really well made, and I think we need when we have these discussions, we need to have a little more discipline in our thinking and our language to be mindful of that. And you mentioned fixing the system, and I guess that's really what these categories are trying to do, fix the system by bringing measures in place that are supporting, but we shouldn't use that language to refer to the people themselves. And I think, yeah, you're right, we're a little loose with the language, typically.
Thank you. I have a question here about staff diversity. So to the point about people being human, the question is, staff diversity is critical in universities. What can be done to improve this? Any thoughts from panel members on that? Alec?
The student of today is the staff of tomorrow.
Very good, thank you.
I also think becoming employers of choice is really important, and if we're attractive places to work, hopefully that helps address the issue in time, particularly if we have removed many of the barriers that have been there in the past.
Thank you. Other questions? There's one here. David Bowd. Is it David Bowd? No, sorry. Oh, it's...
Jonathan Powell.
Sorry, Jonathan. Welcome
Central
back
Queensland.
from Scotland.
Well, I'd be delighted
Sorry.
to be mistaken for David Bowd.
Sorry.
So I enjoyed the exchange between Matt and Alec, and I absolutely enjoyed the passionate location of the equity agenda of the Group of Eight within the research ethos. The only thing that rang a little bit false maybe was the sense that possibly our institutions might look look quite the same after implementing the measures that confront us in the Accord. And if I know one thing, I think that the institutions are going to have to look quite different if we're going to deliver this genuinely. So I'd be interested in the panel's view on what sort of structures, cultures, workforces might we see in the universities of the future if we're genuinely to deliver the equity agenda and the student success agenda that's promised.
Thank you for the question. Thoughts? We are in the post-lunch slump, so wake up, panel members. I know it's a hard question, but...
Well, I'm going to touch on the taboo topic of funding. And really, it will depend a little bit on how it's funded. It's very hard to... I mean, we could talk about what it should be, but what it will be will ultimately depend on the funding that's available. And you know, as we've talked about today, there's been goals set for equity funding in the past, and they haven't been met. So I guess I am being cautious about what it will look like without knowing what the quantum is that supports it behind it.
Paul, and then Matt.
Just sort of thinking about that question and the discussion about language. I think we often talk about ourselves as a sector, or we talk about it in economic terms, or we talk about it in market terms. But I think it's very clear that what the government wants is more collaboration, a more systematic view of the system, and less sort of free market competition. And I think one way to think about your question is to think about, are there going to be new sorts of partnerships and new forms of collaboration, maybe between different kinds of institutions? My hunch is that if you went to a minister like Jason Clare pitching that kind of thing, like we're going to team up with this other institution to offer something in a new way in partnership, that's where you're going to attract new funding, I think.
I absolutely agree. I remember sitting in Dan Tehan's office when he was the minister and pitching an innovative approach. I will say ministers necessarily are always interested in where the money is going to come from. So the approach I pitched was a relation to student contribution, institution contribution and industry contribution. He changed portfolios and moved on, so it didn't happen. But yeah, you're right, but let's not lose sight of the elephant in the room, which is the money. Who's going to pay is a really important part of that. Matt.
Yeah, excellent question. I think Paul's right. Part of the solution is partnerships between providers. I think every institution is going to look a little different as they pursue the targets in what has to be a sort of localised way, given the separate locations, missions of the universities. But again, I go back to the long view, and that these are long-term targets that we're really looking at if we're looking at equity parity. So the system is going to have to change. We're going to need a diversity of different solutions, and that means a diversity of different providers. So I can't predict what the evolution will look like, but that's going to be a big part of the solution. You've sort of asked how will institutions look different, and really I guess the longer term question is how will the whole tertiary education sector look different, and the types of providers in there.
Thank you. Question from the floor. Could you introduce yourself for people online?
My name is Harleen Hain. I am the Vice Chancellor at Curtin University. On the topic of targets, Amar just wrote something on a note here next to me that's really changed my thinking about all of this, that the graduates of 2050 will not be born until 2029. And so the good news is we've got substantial runway to change the conditions of our broader society so that we might actually find ourselves in a position that there will be fewer equity students because there will be a more even playing field. And one of the things that we didn't talk about today in what was our favorite recommendation from the Accord session, one of my favorites is that the government will become a better consumer of university research. And I think we've got a long runway to help government in using evidence that is generated through research at our universities about how we can create a more equitable society more generally, so that children do have access to early childhood education, so that single mothers do have enough money so that they can put food on the table. So I think thinking about these targets, we should also think about the big runway that we could contribute to through the excellent research that happens across the 39 universities that will get government doing the right things so that we lift this situation for everyone.
Thank you. I'll make a comment and then go to the panel. Just building on what you said, now working in government, government don't have time and often don't have the expertise to refereed journal articles. I know careers are built on that. I built my own. I help others do the same thing. You need to translate that stuff into English that busy bureaucrats can read and understand. Don't be clever. Dumb it down if you have to. Make it clear to people who make decisions to empower them.
Yeah, absolutely. In New Zealand, we had a system where we embedded academics into each of the government departments. So they were considered to be the chief scientist of education or transport or whatever. And it was that person's job to do exactly what you've said, is to translate it. And that provided officials with a huge amount of evidence-based information, hot off the press from the universities, that helped them into with their decision-making. It was a nonpartisan approach. And the information and advice was provided without fear or favour, but it gave the government access to, it really opened the doors to the outstanding work that the universities did.
Brilliant, thank you. Paul.
Picking up on that, I think it's a really good point. And one of my personal reflections on the Accord and the last 18 months is that the way we're talking about and making the case for public investment in university research is just not working. Like, we should stop saying, give us more money, give us 3% of GDP. We should start talking about the impact of that research in the community, for government, for decision makers, for business. And that then, I think, feeds back to this question about the culture and the staffing of universities. Are people rewarded to focus on the impact of their research? Are they promoted, et cetera, et cetera?
Thank you. Oh, Shamit. Oh, sorry. Did you want to respond to Harlene's provocation first?
Yes,
Yes, that's okay.
Just going to say that while the targets for the Accord are focused on a particular age group, we shouldn't solely think about the graduates of 2050 solely based on the school leaver cohort. There is a large number of Australians that go through university as mature age students, and they're vitally important in helping us achieve that broader equity.
You're so right. Shamit. Oh, sorry, Matt.
Just a couple of points.
Yes.
Interesting reflection on the use of academic expertise in government. Wouldn't disagree at all. There's always that sort of tension between the time it takes and the complexity of academic considerations and what government needs in terms of policy. But setting that aside, what you've described perhaps motivates discussions that we've had in the group of 8 about what the ATEC should look like, to go back to that. You know, it's that absence of government adopting higher education policy. I don't want to say the absence of policy, because there are lots of great people who do higher education policy, including in this room, but that to have that advice channelled to government in an effective way, that's one of the roles that the group of 8 sees as being central to the ATEC, I guess, and something that we'd really want to protect when it's put together. Also, just to respond to Paul about talking about advocating for research. So when we at the group of 8 think about the 3% target, we're not thinking about asking funding, and certainly not asking government for funding. You know, the truth is that the fact that we're at 1.68% of GDP rather than 3% has to do with business investment in R&D, and that's not to be critical, but that's the diagnosis of the problem. So when we talk to government about that, and we've got a project running right now on this, it's about how do we work together to sort of grow the pie to 3%. It's not saying you just throw money in and you get to 3%. How do we change the structure of our industrial base, our research collaboration between sectors with a 10 to 15 year horizon? How do we do that to generate 3% of activity, and not to just say government needs to do that, because that ain't going to work, as you say.
Thank you. Shamit.
So, I mean, I couldn't agree more with the comment that Paul made a moment ago, and it sparked an interesting discussion. I mean, it does appear very much like yet another producer group saying, can we have some money? I mean, I know you're saying it's more nuanced than that, but frankly, I think in Canberra, that's what people hear. And that needs to change quite rapidly, and there's plenty of opportunities to do so. So you've got a government that's outlining several sectors that will need more graduates or different kinds of graduates. You've got energy transition being the obvious one that's affecting every rich and every poor economy in the world, so that's going to suck in a lot of technical expertise, but also a lot of other graduates. And then you think about all the tech-enabled industries in which graduates will be put to work, not doing necessarily the tech bit, but doing the bit of how do you get people to use the tech-enabled X, Y, and Z in every sector you imagine. So there's a golden opportunity to just follow up on what Paul was saying, I think, in terms of much more sort of challenge-based research agendas. You know, we are here to help, you know, address those kind of gaps in the future. Anyhow, that's just a statement. I want to go back slightly. So different representatives from different groupings are saying that we are different. How surprising. And yet there's commonality, and we should get together and so on. So I guess my question would be, just going forward, and you know, ATEC's just opened its front doors, and they're saying, oh, we're going to be sitting down designing some targets to sort of keep everyone accountable. All these kind of things have been talked about. And so, yet we're different, so we don't want a one-size-fits-all. We all got that. So the expression I'd have for that would be contextualized targets. Right? We want to take something into account, some context. So I want to ask each of the representatives, what 2 or 3 things do they think should be taken into account, the context, before a target is set for your individual members?
Great question, Shannon. You should be chairing this panel. Renee.
So I think the social licence that institutions have is really important and something that we don't talk about enough. You know, a lot of the conversation today has been transactional, but it doesn't take into account some of the broader things that we do, that we are very much place-based institutions. And picking up on what Harleen said before as well, the more that we're in those bigger societal conversations about how we fix energy transition or how we fix workforce for the care sector or whatever it is, when universities are seen as part of the solution, then money flows from that. It's just when the conversation's about money, it's easy to say no, but when you have a solution that's attached to it, it's much harder to take the money away from the table. But so I would say social licence, geography, and a recognition of the workforce needs of the region.
Alec?
I think that, you know, this is a very interesting question. And, you know, from the members of RUN, we have 40 campuses across Australia. And I think about, you know, Jonathan at CQU.
Not David Bound.
Not David. The differences in need for those campuses between Bundaberg and Rockhampton and Cairns are uniquely different, and that needs to be taken into account. And so that nuance that needs to be expressed from not only institutions, advocates like ourselves, but also from the Department of Education and whoever's in the ATEC to actually understand the operating environment and the realities of where universities operate.
I'm just referring back to the research I did with Dan. Take notes, Dan, because I think we need to translate that article good into English. I need to take my own advice. Other comments on that? No?
Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
Paul?
One general observation and one specific example. I think, coming back to the previous discussion about impact, we should be talking about what we think the impact of all of our work and these interventions are and be able to evidence that. So that should be part of how we're thinking about targets. And the specific example is, you know, there's a discussion happening at the moment about whether there'll be some kind of bonus attached to completion rates, for example. We know more and more students are studying part-time. We know the distribution of part-time students is variable across the sector. And that's going to have a direct impact on how we calculate completion rates. So we just have to be sensitive to those things. It's doable, I think, but we just have to be alive to those as we're developing things like completion bonuses, for example.
And I think in terms of equity funding, the part-time point is something that we haven't covered off on, but it is actually really important because the supports have to be provided whether or not you're there 50% of the time or 100% of the time. And I think that is something that we haven't really talked about today, but I just wanted to put on the table.
Thank you. I was just doing eyes at Andrew Harvey, who may wish to say something about that. He doesn't look interested. Take that man a microphone, please. Oh, sorry, there's a question. I'll come back to you. Just on that part-time and taking a long time to complete. Were you listening or were you doing email? You were listening? I've given you the question in summary. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, I listened to all of it. I mean, I think one thing that's interesting post-COVID, we've seen a massive rise in distance enrolments and a rise in part-time as well, which are the two main factors that influence attrition. So we would expect, but we have data from 2022, so we are really flying blind on a lot of the really critical changes that have happened very recently, and I think that point about the timely data is really important. And I also think what used to be performance-based funding and has now been called to the completion outcomes funding, or completion and outcomes funding, I think that's a critical one as well, and it still obviously seems a pretty inchoate discussion, but it's very important that we get that balance right. I think what happened under the demand-driven system is some vice-chancellors, frankly, were very keen on growth and probably enrolled some students who are at high risk of failure, and I think we want to avoid that again, but at the same time we don't want to close doors. So one of the benefits of the enabling programs, for instance, is when they're translated into school preparation programs, secondary schools, is that we know that they work for mature age students. We've done all of that work that Tim Pittman led, who's here, I think. He's definitely here. I don't know if he's here now. So we've done that work. We know that they work for preparation, and what we are doing in equity is we're segmenting access, pre-access, access, success. We're segmenting them all, but actually things like enabling programs do most of those things. So they are the best way of increasing access because we know they increase the market, but they are also the best way of preparing students for success, particularly from marginalised groups. So we've got all sorts of issues around the way we segment our thinking and also in the data in terms of not only the lag, but the impact of that, given so much has happened in the last 2 or 3 years that is quite transformative. So, I mean, that's just a random thought.
Thank you, Andrew. Without notice, thank you very much. Alec, a few people want to respond, and then I'll go to you, because I know you've been waiting. Alec, and then Matt, then.
I think Renee raised a really interesting point, and Andrew touched on it there, is that part-time and distance component. So at RUN, what we've found from our members is that they may be an online student, but they're still on campus, and they'll come in on a needs basis. Now, if they're studying 0.25 load, how do you ration that? Because a person's still a person, and the support services need to be available for the person. And so there's always this, I guess, a disconnect between the funding being on a head count and then an EFSL basis, and how do you reconcile that? And it's something that we need to get on top of, because I think there are going to be additional and growth in the part-time market more than necessarily just the full 18 to 21 straight out of school full-time cohorts.
So those assumptions we sometimes have about what is a student really need to be challenged ongoing. Thank you. Matt.
Just going to go back to the context question, which is, I mean, it's a tricky one, but I think it's difficult to set the context for the university, any university, to say what their context is that should be taken into account. It probably needs to be more of a dialogue with the government in terms of the context you want taken into account. Well, if you're a Group of 8 university, the context is we want to get as many talented people into a university that pursues excellence on an international scale. Now, that's the context, but I guess the targets we might set out of that depends very much on how the system is going to work, what the government's going to put in place, what we can negotiate there. It's the same for Alec, the support that's required there, that's part of the context you want taken into account. So it's not just the university saying this is our context, it needs to be a discussion about the other side, the government, what that's going to supply as well, so you can kind of reach that agreement. Also, I can't help myself, being from the Group of 8, I need to go back to the discussion about 3% of GDP. We have been talking to government in Canberra. You're right, it's not a universal appreciation, but we've been talking to education portfolio, treasury, industry, and there is an appreciation, and industry bodies, and there is an appreciation of what 3% means as not just as a money grab when you're sort of getting deep down into the policy discussions. But you also make a good point about sort of targeting where that research can be useful, and that's sort of also part of the discussion as we link into things like the National Reconstruction Fund or AUKUS Pillar 2 or the quantum strategy, other elements like that. So there's a lot going on in that space, and there are some parts of Canberra that are receptive to those discussions, and probably worth pointing out that the one time I think the R word, research, was mentioned in the higher education budget was around the review of research.
Also an R word.
Sorry, yeah. And part of that review is to look at increasing research intensity, so the amount of expenditure as percentage of GDP in Australia. So that is on the agenda in Canberra.
I would say for...
Quickly, Alex, I'm going to Frank, and there's a very patient person waiting over here for the question. Last question, I think.
For as different as Matt and I are in our philosophical views of the sector, I think you'd be hard-pressed across Australia to find any institution that doesn't strive and achieve excellence, whether that's in research, whether that's in learning and teaching, whether that's driving the equity and social agenda. And I think that while we may disagree, we do have to acknowledge that Australia's universities are world-leading across a wide range of factors.
Thank you, Alec. I'm glad you're best friends forever now.
I know we're running out of time, so I'll try and be quick. I think I'm going to kind of roll, I think it was John's question to Shannon. It's all about the identity and our unique offerings. And if I was in government, I would ask, what is it that you've provided to the goal that I've set as a government? And for instance, as an example for ATN universities, innovative and tech universities, we would then be charged with delivering something towards the goal of 1.2 million tech jobs by 2030. So something that is measurable, and you could answer directly to government, this is what we've delivered, these are the students that we've provided.
Thank you. Over here.
Thank you. I'm Robin Latimer, I'm Director of Learning Services from Torrens University, Australia. I was waiting for a while, so I'm kind of taking the conversation back a bit, I think, to the question links in with the man who's not David Bowd, sorry. You'll forever be known as the not David Bowd.
I'm so sorry, Jonathan.
With the conversation about harmonisation of the sector, I've worked in vet and higher education. I've wrangled ASQA and TEXA. I'm curious about it being either or. I'd like to hear about more innovative approaches. Is there room for a third space where it's a combination? You know, we're talking about job-ready graduates. There's parts you need of theory, there's parts in practice. And to be more appealing to equity group students, to rural students for what they might need to do in their community. My own son was an engineering student and hated the theory, and he left, and he's absolutely excelled in the workplace because he can do the practical, but never got to do that at university. So I just would like, and I guess coming from I'm a creative in my history of my profession, can we think outside and beyond the either or?
Thank you. Great question. This is our last, and we're out of time, and I'm getting evil eyes from Ian, and I'm a bit scared of him. So 30 seconds each. Renee.
Yes, we should. I think the TAFE Centres of Excellence are a really good place to start. There's an opportunity for us to pilot some things that are both impactful and different.
Thank you. Paul?
Agree, and just a personal reflection, having been the education person in our embassy in Tokyo, we used to talk with the Japanese Ministry of Education about how this stuff works. In Japan, nobody moves between higher education, university or TAFE or other parts of the system. And students in our system are able to do it. And so could we make that smoother? Could we improve harmonisation? Could we finish AQF reform? Could we do these things? Yes, we can. But I think as a final comment from me, I would want to say let's not forget that we have things about our system that are good, and let's be proud of those and build on those.
Thanks, Paul. Frank?
To Renee's point, the TAFE Centres of Excellence is kind of where we're going, and industry is kind of that third wheel in some respects because they're looking for the skills that we're providing, and if we can harmonise between, obviously, all parts in tertiary education, I think that's the right path that we're taking. And just as a final point, I think in my mind, education is as important a resource to this country as the stuff that we dig out of the ground.
Thanks, Frank. Matt?
Yeah, so we need to, I think, step back to think of the diversity in the sector in the longer term. So again, the TAFE centres are excellent, but looking at the big picture, We've got to increase the diversity in the sector, which means changing the definitions of institutions, the categories, changing the funding systems that sort of drive universities in particular into certain enrolment behaviours that preclude specialisation. So there's a whole big piece of work there, and let's throw it to the ATEC. But I think that's the longer term answer to your question.
Thanks. And Alec,
I would
last
say
word.
let's not wait for the ATEC. Let's actually learn from what's happening right now on regional university campuses. Without giving away my humble origins, I went to Mackay for high school. My year 12 grade, 50% went to university, 50% went to trade. And everyone that went to university left Mackay. Now I think about CQU's campus up there with their trade school that is integrating the technical and the university aspect, and it is a model that is bringing vibrancy to that community and that campus, and there's no longer a choice. The students can go there and to interact with both because it's valid for the industry as well, that is playing in and going, we want those graduates because they have a little bit extra, because they're exposed to both the vet and the higher ed. And of course, Renee with the Centres of Excellence, yes.
Great question, Robin. Thank you, and thank you for waiting. We're out of time. Could you please join me in thanking Renee, Paul, Frank, Matt and Alec? Great, thank you. Well done.